Morning.
Morning, Howard. Thank you, everyone, for joining. Today, we are hosting honor students from the University of KwaZulu-Natal. We feel a link between the institute and the university is always important. Always, let's just be aware of what's happening at the university. Beyond just us coming in as externals and all that. So we will continue to create that link as much as possible. So today we are hosting the honor students led by Magda and Viloshan. So it's students who've been looking at urban settlements on the continent so that we can learn some good design principles from culture that's very close to us. So I'm going to introduce the lecturers and then they will take it from there with the students. So Magda is a professional architect and academic. She studied at the universities of Natal and Free State, completing a four-year PIAC degree in 1996 and an advanced PIAC in 1998. She worked in London and Cambridge for 6 years as an architect, returned to SA in 2005 with a short stint at Design Workshop before joining TUT, where she taught for 5 years. She then moved to UKZN. She has taught across all the years, mostly in theory and design, since 2017, and in the postgraduate program. She completed a master's in research by 2016 and is at the end of her PhD journey, hoping to graduate later this year. On the side, she's raising 4 kids and sometimes collaborates with her husband, who is an architect in practice. Dr. Viloshan Kavina is a senior lecturer at UKZN. He teaches the honors full-time cohort and supervises master students. Dr. Kavina's research involves working with marginalized communities, especially those in informal settlements, using drone technologies and community-led collaboration to create solutions that form a bottom-up approach. He has worked with many NGOs and municipalities to deal with informality, settlement upgrading, and early warning systems for vulnerable communities. He is also a practicing architect with research interests that include resilient cities, building adaptability, and how insurgency affects city planning. Dr. Kamina straddles 2 worlds, designing high-end houses and double-story shacks. Colleagues, up to you.
Thanks, Guru. I think what we want to do is just introduce the course at UKZN and how we run our postgrad studio. So we've got a little presentation I'll just share, and between Magda and I will go over them. Can everyone see this?
Yes.
Yes, dear.
Thank you. I'm sorry, my dogs are barking in the background. Good morning, everyone. It's nice and early on a Friday. So just to introduce this, we developed a program for honors kind of before COVID, and then we were able to implement it in 2021. I think what stands out with this program, it's got a very distinct research-driven approach, as well as trying to work towards sustainable communities and also dealing with kind of preparing students for becoming agents of change in society. So not just being an architect that makes money, but actually creating change. Villa, next slide, please. So the vision of the program, this is kind of looking at all the modules and seeing how we fit into the university, which is, African scholarship is quite a strong element at the university. So we encourage research, we look at literature and policy, we supporting critical scholarship, we promoting access, specifically trying to accommodate previously historically marginalized communities, not just in access to the university, but also how we engage with them. We promote collaboration, and most recently we collaborated with the city architects not just the city, Mile and other people in the city. as well as working with some of the engineering programs. And then I think it's about being innovative and finding new ways of engaging with our built environment and trying to work towards that bottom-up approach that Villa was talking about as well. Go next one. So yeah, this is a little bit more. It explains how we work, and I think one of the main things is that it's not us teaching students. It's very much we learning together, learning with our communities, learning through research and finding the information out there and bringing it back. And quite often students would what we call a flipped classroom, where they present the work to each other. So it's definitely not a lecturer-centered approach where we are always teaching them. We teach each other and we learn through that. And then we have a very diverse profile. Some of you who have students who are employed in your offices, but also studying would know we offer the part-time as well as the full-time program. And that's been quite interesting because we have students in Cape Town and Zimbabwe and, Joburg and all over the country, even one from the Free State last year. And it's been quite interesting. This little photograph we started in 2022 when COVID was still running. You can see the masks there, some of us. And this was our first meeting with our students. So it's been interesting to run and start a program during the COVID years, but it learns us those skills of running a studio online as well. Next slide, Villa. So just to understand where we fit in, and if you look at the kind of the structure, it's rooted in architectural research methods, which provides a basis. Obviously, the architectural design and urbanism module is quite strong, and that's one that they start with. The history of architecture and urbanism is an annual module, and this is where this particular project fits in. It's kind of a combination of understanding history and how that informs our design as well as theory. So it's integrated. And then the students do an individual architectural research project, like a little mini thesis. And from that, they also do the advanced architectural technology. So that's an integrated technology module. And then we also have a module run by Prof. Kathy Sutherland called Environment and Development, which throws in a really strong sustainable focus in the way that the students work. Next slide. Or do we go to yours now? Okay, yeah, this just shows how the part-time and full-time works. It's quite complicated, and sometimes the students and the staff don't quite know where they fit, but we do. And we did this. This is extract from our presentation for our SAIA accreditation last year, where we got full accreditation. And this was just showing, you've got full-time students who would start, and then you've got part-time students, and they will continue on another year, and it becomes really quite messy sometimes, but we do know what we're doing, and we've had our first part-time class graduating earlier this year, which was really exciting. Yeah. Is there anything else for me, Vinod?
No, I think I
Okay,
can
you
take
can
over.
take over. Yeah.
Yeah. So another thing about the school is that we're one of the only schools in the country that offer this part-time course. And what we found is that it's been transformative. It gives people access who couldn't have access before to study and further their education. Because at that level, if you're working a full-time job, to leave work and commit yourself to furthering your studies, it's hard. So this part-time course has really opened doors for lots of people who can still work and still study at the same time. And we've seen, every year we're getting more and more applications. It's been a successful program so far. So I just want to go over, I think, our main course, which is design, and talk a bit about how we approach design in the studio and our scope. So this is just a basic overview of the NQF level, which is level 8 that we need to achieve. And it's really centered around the application of, oh, sorry about that. That's the birds in the background. Really centered, oh gosh, that's Durban, around urban design theories, concepts, and principles of urban design. So in fourth year, which was previously a 2-year master's degrees, we broke it up now into an honors degree, which at the end of the year, you could exit with an honors degree and choose to further your studies with the master's the following year, or wait a while and come back to do the master's. So the fourth year really is about understanding the application of urban design and context and how it influences the design. So we also delve into different methodologies, which is very important in understanding how do you get to a design? How do you answer questions or critically ask the right questions to get a solution? So methodologies are quite important for us. And we look at different methodologies such as transect walks, using a bottom-up approach, mapping at different scales. And we sort of distribute these kind of methodologies throughout the semester. So at the end of it, the student has the tools to get the answers or to collect data to ask the right questions. So one of the first tasks we do is mapping our existing city. So we usually choose precincts, for example, like the Gateway Precinct or Kunubia, and we put students into groups to map and understand how does this precinct work, what urban design theories were applied, and understand whether they were successful or not. So this gives the students a first-hand experience on how theory is actually applied. You know, previously it's always you learn theory from a book or journals, and you never understand how you really apply it into a context. So this exercise really gives that application of the theory, which is very important. Then we start splitting them into further groups when we give them a site area, and we start mapping at various scales. So what we found, the mapping at the various scales allows the student to understand the context even better from a macro, meso, and micro scales. Some of the context which we've worked in is the Point Precinct. We've done Warwick Junction, Giba Gorge. Now we're doing West Town, which is quite interesting because we are looking at a developer-driven approach to creating a city and allowing the students to use that approach, understand it, and shape the city to what they think is the correct approach. So we're doing that in collaboration with the engineering students as well. And probably at the end, I think we'll invite those developers to studio and show them our approach to urban design. And we can contrast the pros and cons of both. So the mapping at various scales allows us to critically analyze context, to get information which is often, secondary, but we mix it also with primary research by doing transect walks. And this information is very useful because it also forms part of adding to the body of knowledge, which we can publish about our city. And from this mapping exercises, we get something called the design drivers. So after they collect the data, it's important that students realize, how does this now inform design? Right? Design should be informed by the drivers that come from the research. And it's not something that you download off Pinterest or find online. It's really context-driven, responsive design solutions. And then the students use these bottom-up approaches to design an urban intervention. And this is done in groups, groups of 4 to 5 students, and they create these urban interventions for the context. And some of them are quite broad and quite big interventions, but we allow them to explore and just to try new ideas. And then this is the urban design, some examples of when we were working in Warwick and some of the solutions they came up with. And from this, the students have to design their own plots. And what happens is that these plots become the individual response that they take forward as the next project where they do a housing solution on these plots that they've designed. So the individual design that they then do refers back to the urban design that they've done as a group. and uses the same research and synthesis that they've found from those solutions. The part-time class also follows the same kind of program, but we spread it out over 2 years. So because it's part-time is 2 years. Yeah, I think that's it. Thank you.
Before we move on, but I just want to quickly talk about the specific project. So some of our younger architects that's come through the Masters 1 program, and I think, Villa, you also did a very similar project, which Bridget, Dr. Horner, had started. And I think the focus was very much in how you engage when not to always just read up. And we as visual people, sometimes by drawing by hand those plans, you learn so much more. And it's so I inherited the project from Bridget, and we've integrated it into this new program. And this year, Vilo joined me in the module. It's part of the history and theory of architecture and urbanism course. And the focus this year is just on African cities, but we've done it in different ways. We would focus on, okay, it needs to have a water's edge or kind of a strong connection to a river or something like that. And then you start to look at how did the city develop in relationship to that. So just I think in the African cities, that's also been interesting because the colonial influence becomes quite strong. And yeah, through the mapping, you will see what they've done. Those of you who have been to the Institute and have looked at the drawings would also enjoy that. And then, yeah, the last 2 years, Rodney Harbour was our external, and it was amazing. The first year that he joined, he'd been to all the cities, and he could really engage so well with the students. So that was, I miss him when we do this project now. But I think it's that, and some of the students also said, no, now I want to go to that city and I'll actually be able to understand it better. So just, yeah, a little bit on that and just where it was rooted. And I think we can hand over to the students now, Vilo.
Yeah, I think thanks, Magda. Let's start with our first group. So the first group, you guys can share the screen. I think just introduce yourselves and the city you're working in.
I'm just waiting for Shahid to share screen.
Yeah, just let me know if you guys can see.
You can.
Okay.
Okay,
Cool.
so morning everyone. I'm Nuria and my group partner is Shahid. We've chosen Marrakesh in Morocco to study over the colonization, independence, globalization, and modernization eras. So we chose Marrakesh because although it's quite a busy city and it's quite a large tourist destination, its urban development seemed to be largely under-researched. So we wanted to contribute to that. Next slide. So starting with some basic background before the colonization of Marrakesh, the city was founded in 1062 by the Almoravids dynasty and served as the capital until it fell to the Almohads in 1147 and then to the Marinids in 1269. And under the Marinid rule, the northern city of Fez became the capital, which caused a decline in Marrakesh's economy. And then in the 16th century, the Saudians made Marrakesh their capital again, which allowed for a boom in their economy. And then later in 1911, the capital was once again moved, although this time it was to Rabat. And Marrakesh was made the capital of the mid-southwestern region of the country. In 1912, Marrakesh was captured by the religious leader Ahmed al-Keba, who was soon defeated and then driven out by French forces, which led to the colonization of Marrakesh. And further to that, from 1912 to 1956, Marrakesh resided under the French protectorate. And during this time, the French implemented various infrastructural projects and administrative reforms in Marrakesh and other parts of Morocco. Can we go to the next slide? Sorry, just a second. So the sketch that we have on the screen is a depiction of the Medina in Marrakesh, which is also known as the Red City. The Medina is essentially the city center of Marrakesh and is made up of densely packed traditional urban dwellings and marketplaces along winding pathways and roads. And most buildings are limited to 2 floors with architecture characterized by plain exterior walls, which reflect the cultural values of privacy and modesty, which is prevalent in Marrakesh. We can go on to the next slide.
Okay, and then I'll just take us through our sort of mapping. So as Nuria mentioned, the sort of area that we focused on is the Medina itself, which you see in this sort of drawing that depicts this very densely populated space. But we've also focused on the Giliz, which is the area just to the northwest of the Medina, which is where most of the urban development would have taken place. So immediately after the French came into power in 1912, construction of these gillies began, which is where the French sort of established their presence. The master plan for Marrakesh was proposed by a French urban planner named Henry Prost in 1920, who sort of emphasized the contrast between that Medina, which is seen as disordered and sort of incoherent, and the very ordered French urban planning that you'll begin to see develop over time. And then just going into the independence era. So the French introduced modern amenities within the Gillies, such as schools, hospitals, government offices, sort of reflecting European influence. And the regulations that the French put into place restricted development within the Islamic city center, which created this lasting segregation between the French and Islamic communities. And that segregation is evident in the contrast between the sort of organic Medina and the very ordered spatial structure of the Gillies. The urbanization and industrial development taking place just outside the Medina would have attracted high volumes of rural workers from other parts of Morocco, which created this severe densification and this population overspill within the Medina, resulting in housing shortages. So as a response to this, much of the sort of farmland along the Medina perimeter was converted to informal housing areas known as douars by the big landowners at the time, which served to further exacerbate that social stratification. And then within the early stages of Moroccan independence, much of the focus was placed on restoring and developing that countryside. So during the modernization era, there was much major infrastructure expansion as well as modernization within the Medina with the aim of encouraging more tourist attraction, converting many of their homes into hotels and more commercial services. This also came as a result of that population spilling over into the West. And then just during the globalization and modern era, that development towards the West becomes more apparent. Despite the creation of a new town at the fringe of Marrakesh, the urbanization front begins to sort of develop from north to south. Within the Medina itself, though, you get these problems of traffic congestion and social issues systematically undermining both that centrality and the attractiveness of the historic core as a place of residence and tourism. And then we've just looked at the sort of movement structure, and then I'll just take us through that as well. So prior to the colonial rule, much of the emphasis would have been placed on access to the Medina being minimal, as they focus more on like defensible architecture within these ramparts, which you see shown by the dotted line. And then the circulation within the densely packed Medina is focused more on like pedestrian movements, as it's so like densely packed. With the establishment of the French rule came this implementation of basic transport infrastructure such as roads and railways, primarily for their strategic and administrative purposes. And then, yeah, the expansion of that road network begins to show the apparent influence of French urban planning, contrasting the Medina once again, with the introduction of motorized transport into the center, also further influenced urbanization of the Medina. And then the Galiz expressed this radial road formation with the roads being used as like linking devices between public nodes, which is like a general characteristic with the French urban planning. And then towards the 60s, you get this rapid urbanization of the Medina, which created severe issues with traffic congestion within the city as a result of there being very minimal circulation beyond the confines of the ramparts. Whereas the Gillies experienced not much development in this time period, as much of the road network was already basically established at this time. And then moving on to current time, you get the expansion and modernization of the roads and the transport systems were prioritized to improve connectivity within the city. With the focus being on tourism, more emphasis was put on vehicular movement, both within the center and on the outskirts. And initiatives were put into place, such as the Marrakesh Minara Airport and the development of these public transport networks, such as like buses and taxis, to further enhance mobility for the residents and for the visitors. And then we've just looked at the sort of zoning and how it progressed over time. So the construction of the Gillies serviced the French and established the development of this European city within Marrakesh, which is what it's sort of known as today. And to facilitate this, much of the agricultural land and farmland was converted to industrial zones, further contributing to urbanization and population growth. Whereas within the Medina itself, overcrowding and limited space as a result of that segregation resulted in densification and the transformation of many of the residential areas into commercial zones to accommodate that economic activity. This is the reason you sort of see a blur in the distinction between commercial and residential zoning, resulting in more of like a mix of the two. And then just following Morocco's independence, much of the land use policies focused primarily on rural development with limited intervention in urban areas. In order to reduce this rural to urban migration, efforts were made to address rural poverty by promoting agricultural productivity. This is why in our mapping, you sort of see the development of these large agriculture areas and green spaces, both within and outside the city center. You also see more of a distinction between the residential space and the commercial space within the center as a result of that densification requiring more housing. And then just going into the modernization, that need for residential accommodation becomes more apparent, where you begin to see more of the Medina being altered to facilitate that rapid population growth. And you begin to see the creation of these new residential and commercial zones. The Gillies also began to establish itself as more of a tourist attraction, with the development of more commercial zones spilling towards the south. The population growth also resulted in more douars and more informal settlement within these agricultural zones. And then just coming to the modern era, much of the agricultural land was converted to urban areas. So the emphasis on tourism resulted in much of the residential area being converted into a mix of commercial and residential zoning. So in order to facilitate for like hotels and tourist-oriented facilities, the city has seen this emergence of new urban districts, luxury residential developments, and tourist infrastructure in order to aid that economic growth. And then we've just sort of looked at the green space network. With Morocco boasts a more sort of arid climate, so there would not have been much in the way of green space within Marrakesh. During the French colonial rule, there was very limited emphasis on the development of these green spaces. Much of their focus was on the urban planning and infrastructure development rather than these recreational or environmental amenities. And then following Marrakesh's independence, more emphasis was placed on the importance of green space to help promote, urban well-being and environmental sustainability. This is why you see the development of these like large parks spaces in the southern areas of the Gillies. And then in order to further improve that their urban environments, more efforts were made by creating these public parks and recreational areas for the residences within the city. And you also see the emphasis on rural development through agricultural land as expressed by the map, where you see these large areas of agricultural land in the lower areas of the Gillies. And then moving towards the modern era, you start to see these gardens within the Medina start to become sort of reduced in order to facilitate for more of that accommodation and tourism. So the focus on green space now becomes more apparent on the outside of Medina, where parks now become integrated within the commercial and residential zones, becoming more of a beautification of the tourist areas rather than for the actual residents. So it's further emphasizing the result of the globalization within Marrakesh. And then we sort of concluded by isolating the town grain alongside these sketches to explain our interpretation, to like emphasize our findings in this presentation. So the clearest point being that drastic contrast between the very historic Medina and the French Gillies. So Marrakesh itself boasts this very deep historic background with clear Islamic influence, as seen in the Qutubiyya Mosque, which was built in 1150 and continues to stand as a historical landmark, you know. And then over time, you start to see how the structured French urban development continued to influence Marrakesh almost as a contradiction to their own cultural identity. So their response to the density of the Medina is what allowed them to create these iconic spaces such as the market space in the Bin Yusuf Madrasa, where you further see that Islamic identity through the use of arches and colonnades and such. And then towards the 60s, you start to see how the grain develops, with the Gilis becoming more structured and rigid, and all of the development taking place on the outside of the historic Medina. In a way, this might have preserved the history of the Medina, if not for the severe globalization, placing emphasis on tourism generation. So these historic cultural spaces start to become symbols. Yeah, and then finally in the modern era, you see this sort of ultimate expression of that contrast, where the sketch of the Medina with its densely packed structures and winding streets shows how the organic development within the confines of those defensible ramparts resulted in this very unique urban setting. That's something that's unique to Marrakesh itself, whereas the Gilis being a clear contradiction to that history, showing the influence of French urban planning with these clear lines and strong radial linkages, whereas the Medina, you know, fully represents Marrakesh's historic background. And it's sort of that harmonious balance between the two that symbolizes what Marrakesh is today. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Shahid and Nuria. I think we'll have the next group and then we can do questions after, I think. So group 2.
I'm just sharing my screen. Okay. Can you hear us fine? Is everything okay? Okay. Good morning, everyone. Presenting Port Louis is myself, Ilham Bauda, and my partner, Coil, and we are very excited to do this. So we are ready to present, Coil. Just one second. Sorry. Okay. Mauritius can be seen located in the Indian Ocean, and it is divided into 9 states, Port Louis being the capital. Okay. Pictured here is Port Louis in 2017. It showcases the famous Cowden waterfront. Excuse my pronunciation of the place. And this is the heart of Port Louis. It is the city center and is a center of trade and commerce. Here we start with the town origins. Of the 3 colonizations of Port Louis, the Dutch was first in 1598, but due to its lack of economic success, the island was abandoned, and for that reason, we won't be discussing it further. Thereafter, in 1715, was the island colonized by the French, and it is known as Isle de France. It began to undergo significant development, especially in terms of agriculture, their naval base, and a trade center. British. So post-neo-colonial wars between the French and the British ruling began in 1810. Administrative, educational, economic, and infrastructural systems and developments progressed and began the steady modernization of Port Louis. Post-colonization in 1968, did the island become independent and democratic? The population increased, and so did the urban fabric densify. And then globalization. While several factors modernized, the significant and historical infrastructure at the heart of the city was retained. Just to note, for future reference, the blue outlines the port, which is going to be very impactful in the development of Port Louis. You can go now, Coyle. Like the other groups, we're going to go on to movement structure. And during the French ruling, was the movement predominantly pedestrian friendly, not much growth. Next slide. And during the British ruling, other networks developed considerably, including roads, railways, canals, the port, and most importantly, adjacent to the port was the immigration depot. Thank you. Post-colonization, there were significant efforts in the development of the road network due to the introduction of motorized vehicular movement. Due to the growing significance of the trade and commerce between Port Louis and its surroundings, rail networks developed as well, and as an alternative to the port. And throughout history and present day, the port will remain of utmost importance. Next one. Moving on to land use. Moving on to land use quote. Thank you. French first. The French and British, as you will see, has similarly divided the city for residential to be on the outskirts and make use of the sloping land, and for the inner city where the flatter land is to be for the port, closer to the port for commercial. Next slide. In the British colonial rule, the city's layout was formalized specifically by Professor Thornton White's master plan and introduced land use for the industrial area as well. Next slide. Professor Thornton White's master plan continued to influence the city's layout as it developed into a more of a gridiron pattern. The layout was influenced by significant and natural elements of the city as indicated by the sketch, namely the port and the mountain range. Thank you. By globalization and present day, the land use has become more traditional in the efforts to minimize the need for any or an abundance of mixed development. There is a lot of importance placed onto the green spaces being preserved, so there's pedestrian-friendly interfaces in the city. Thank you. Well, you go.
Moving on to green network spaces, as previously mentioned, there was no significant green network during the Dutch colonial period. Port Louis's green space network slowly started to emerge during the French colonial era. Recreational amenities began to formalize and continued to develop. With the rapid development of Port Louis during the British colonial era, there was significant removal of green spaces to accommodate urbanization. Simultaneously, conservation initiatives began to flourish. Post-colonization, many efforts were made to continue urbanization. Parks and gardens as well as recreational spaces continued to expand as a result of the urbanization, whilst preservation efforts were made to protect coastal areas and environmentally vulnerable locations. As seen in the figure, there is a significant decrease along the coastal edge. Due to rapid development, green spaces were converted to residential, commercial, and industrial spaces as seen in the figure graph. However, during this conversion, efforts were made to conserve the heritage of the city. Initially, Port Louis was built as a fortified city with a commercial core, practicing the gridiron street pattern introduced by the French. Rural settlement began to develop along the outskirts of the city, once again depicting hierarchy of a fortified city. As urbanization increased, there was additions of road, bridges, and other movement infrastructure. This can be seen in the figure graph. As the gridiron pattern was maintained, the space became more defined due to expansion. During the era of post-colonization, the city started to become highly populated, once again still maintaining the gridiron pattern. Existing recreational among other facilities began to redevelop. Globalization drew investment to the city, allowing further redevelopment to occur. Modernized buildings began to emerge as a result of this economic change. One major factor that can be seen throughout this era is the gridiron pattern, which was maintained, and only impactful redevelopment occurred. Now moving on to town drain, as mentioned, Port Louis was a fortified city. Therefore, many architectural features were developed to enforce this fortification, whilst observing a variety of land use initiatives to help generate economic activity. Improvement to the city's infrastructure began during the British era, alongside new construction of roads, bridges, and public buildings. Due to the rising population in this era, residential areas expanded significantly to accommodate this. Tourism began to emerge, causing economic growth for the country, resulting in the construction of hotels and recreational amenities near the coastal front. A large portion of The infrastructure at Port Louis after globalization is situated to accommodate tourism. Following the timeline, we understand that the Dutch built Port Louis's first basic infrastructure, including small ports and agricultural facilities, but faced limited development due to their brief presence. The French built more infrastructure to support the sugar industry, including roads, irrigation systems, and larger plantations. The British continued to improve infrastructure, focusing on transportation and communication networks, and connected sugar plantation to ports and towns. After Port Louis's independence, large investments were made in modern infrastructure to support its expanding economy. Mauritius now has a high economic growth due to tourism, while Port Louis has consistently invested in infrastructure development to promote economic growth and integration into the global economy. Port Louis has evolved into a well-developed city with a foundation for future growth, influenced by the steady growth and significant changes since 1638.
And this interpretation shows the town grains side by side to illustrate the growth and development of the infrastructure. The brief occupation of the Dutch saw minimal influence on Port Louis. The French occupation grew Port Louis from a small trading port. And as it developed, the British paid considerable attention to the gridiron layout, which has remained consistent during the post-colonization and globalization period. Illustrated by the comparative sketches, Port Louis' evident investment in modernization has supported the preservation of its existing significant and historical infrastructure, such as the court or statues and other important artifacts that have been laid out in the city. And Port Louis is now developed into a cosmopolitan and tourist hotspot that we know today presently. Thank you. Coyle?
From myself, Coyle Danlaw, and Ilham Baudo, we thank you for your attention and interest in our presentation. We appreciate your time and hope you find this information valuable. We value your feedback and are happy to answer any questions once all the presentations are concluded. Thank you.
Thanks, Coyle and Ilham. Yeah, we'll ask questions at the end, I guess. Thank you very much. Can we have our next group?
Is my screen showing?
Yes, we can see it, Shulam.
Okay. Good morning. So I'm Shirin Kassam and my group member is Sayesh Mudli. And for this exercise, we've chosen Cairo, which is located in Egypt. Just a brief background on Cairo. So it's actually the largest city in Egypt, and it has, despite its now quite modern and contemporary appearance, it's quite a historical significance. The city was actually formed around the Nile, which acted as a lifeline, not just providing food, but transportation and access to trade. So the language that is spoken in Egypt is quite a good reflection of its history, because although Arabic is the most common language spoken, French and English are also not uncommon in the area. Here looking at the pictorial view, you can see that Islamic architecture was quite prevalent in within the city. And I think it's been referred to as the city of 1,000 minarets, which are these long kind of tower structures where the call to prayer will be made for in the mosque. And I think it's just this blend of contemporary styles and now the traditional architecture makes for a very interesting cityscape. And I think that is what's quite fascinating about Egypt as a whole, which is quite interesting.
Okay, so starting off with town origins, during the colonial period, the British and French developed Cairo's urban fabric according to a familiar European style through grid patterns and strategic planning. This change was different compared to the more organic layouts based on location of resources used in ancient times. During the colonial period, the grid structure created more public spaces due to the lack of urban density. As time went on, the urban density continued to grow, creating more housing and job opportunities within Cairo. For this reason, many people from the surrounding districts and towns moved towards the city. With the independence came a more modernist approach, thus still following some of the Eurocentric trends. Due to the rise in population in Cairo, the post-colonial government introduced public housing in the form of high-rise mixed-use buildings and a variety of apartments. However, the large influx of people caused overcrowding and made it difficult for the government to keep up. This further led to informal housing in vacant plots around the city. The 21st century brought about many changes in lifestyle and density. The city continued to grow with the rise of skyscrapers and mixed-use developments. Rapid urbanization has still created challenges in accommodating the continuous influx of people. However, the ongoing evolution has allowed for a balance of culture and heritage while still following the trends of globalization and modernity. As seen in these depictions of town origin, the buildings highlighted in the red symbolize 3 of the oldest buildings in Cairo, as well as being some of the oldest mosques in Africa. These buildings highlight Cairo's emphasis on education and culture, as well as its rich history in Islamic architecture.
So moving on to the movement structure, initially, so these roads were quite informal kind of pathways, and some were formalized paving and as such. But initially, the railway system was introduced by the British. This was mainly to facilitate the trade between them and the colonies. And then later on, they introduced these trams, which were at this point not for public transportation, but more for transportation of goods, freight as such. And then post colonization, the roads began to get more formalized and widened to accommodate this growth in population. Um, Moving on, the globalization period, in the early 2000s marked the introduction of the ring road, which kind of connected the entire city together. And due to the space constraints, there was this kind of as we previously mentioned, like the buildings now started getting quite moving into the high-rise type of typologies. And I think this kind of thing kind of also applied with the road networks, where moving in like elevating, looking at bridges and tunnels. And yeah, so these roads were developed and getting more formalized, widened to accommodate this influx of people coming within the city. And then another thing is now currently there's this sort of movement to kind of prioritize public transportation and walkability within the city. And I think that's where we are now with the current movement structure.
So looking at land use and zoning, as previously stated, the colonial rule involved creating facilities that were more prominent in the European context. So many of these facilities were developed along the Nile for easy access and control. So this created inequality as the areas of resources were developed more for the wealthier ethnic and social groups. Continuing through the post-colonial period, the urban landscape remained the same. During this period, Cairo and Egypt in general went through an economic stagnation due to the changes in government and many other political influences. Building density moderately increased around the Nile, yet the surrounding areas were not developed further. A more liberated approach was taken during the globalization period, allowing for the economic reforms the city needed. This further increased the zoning towards a mixed use and commercial zones to cater for the population influx.
So looking at the open and green space networks, you see it's quite an arid climate. However, during around areas where the British were situated during the colonization period, there were prominent open spaces such as the Garden City, which were quite luxurious, quite developed and landscaped areas. And you'd see these more clustered spaces. This is where the locals resided, and these were not developed in terms of greenery and things like that. I think the greenery was a reflection of the class at the time. And moving on, so the post colonization, I think there was a movement to kind of reclaim the city by the locals. As such, there was new green spaces which were introduced, and these were designed to kind of reflect the culture of the people, kind of like bring about a sense of identity. And then now, looking at the globalization period, there's almost like a kind of like a reverse process, because due to the rapid densification, this meant that the open spaces that were previously available uh, now are now being developed on, hence reducing the amount of open space that we've seen previously. Yeah.
So in analyzing the internal spaces, we noticed that the use of wide streets and spacious layouts were implemented during the colonial rule. This was to mimic the layouts of the British cities. So this resulted in an abundance of public spaces, such as boulevards and thoroughfares. So the large block patterns accommodated the sense of openness through buildings being very spread out. However, the urban sprawl that started in the post-colonial period dictated that the internal spaces be divided to accommodate a larger number of taller buildings. This further decreased the amount of public and green spaces and introduced more institutionalized spaces. The continuous growth furthered the process from the post-colonial period into globalization period. However, the exhibition, cultural spaces, and sporting facilities were given some sort of priority, thus creating more amenities within the densification. The future plans of the city show an attempt to create an urban environment not only good enough for people to live in, but good enough for them to live in comfortably.
Looking at the town grain, so a pre-colonization, there was kind of the spread of clusters which were densely populated. However, during the colonization period, a lot of growth did take place. But there's areas of tightly or densely packed kind of buildings, which were mainly for the locals, which were kind of where they were kind of segregated to. And this was more away from the European quarters. And this was only amplified by the urban planning, which we've shown. Post-colonization, as we mentioned, there was economic stagnation. However, there was a rapid densification that took place. So if you look at these much longer kind of structures that we see, these were now the mixed-use buildings that came into play, and these were much more middle to high-rise kind of structures to facilitate the growth that took place. Around this time, another significant building that took place. So on the island across the Nile, there is a sports precinct that came into play, and I think this was quite a significant thing at the time because this focused. So the locals struggled to find an identity, and although sports was played, it was like a golf, cricket, nothing that really reflected the local culture. And then by introducing this sports precinct, I think soccer was introduced, and that was kind of helped develop the city. And yeah, then moving forward, um, here we see the many influences that took place. We can see the grain still remains the original grain where the Egyptians, the locals were, and then you see the British as well as the French influence. Yeah, and now it's very much a modern city. And if you look to the west, you see the informality that's taking place due to this kind of surge again in population or the exponential growth that's taking place. And again, you see to the top the densely populated formal as well, and then to the north the longer mixed-use structures that came into play. And here we've done some sketches just to, again, it's just that contrast between the new kind of contemporary and high-rise versus the low kind of clusters of housing and low rise kind of buildings. And it's just a very interesting play. And um, again, now looking at a much more modern city of what Cairo is, I think Sayesh will talk to this a bit more.
Yeah, so Cairo is a city that has undergone constant progression. So it's experienced like rapid urbanization and population growth, leading to the city's expansion beyond its historic core. Suburban developments, high-rise buildings, as well as infrastructure projects have transformed the cityscape. However, challenges such as traffic congestion, informal settlements, and preservation of cultural heritage has emerged as a key concern in contemporary urban planning efforts. Throughout its history, Cairo's urban design reflects a tapestry of cultural, religious, and political influences, contributing to its status as one of the world's most historically significant cities. And that ends our presentation of Cairo.
Thanks, Shreem and Jaish. Can we have the next group? We've got 2 more groups to go. Kulelwa, we can see your screen. You can start.
Oh, sorry, I've been speaking like I was on mute. Sorry, everyone. Let's start again. Habari za asubuhi wote. So that's just basically my group and I greeting everyone in Swahili. It's one of the local languages spoken in our chosen city. Right. Good morning, everyone. My name is Wilela Belfour, and I'm in a group with Mezim Selegu and Mashiri Malihase. So our chosen city for Mapping Urban Histories is the city of Lubumbashi in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Right. So basically, we chose this city because of its rigid fabric and, you know, also the interest in the colonial influence. Yeah, basically. And also just to give you like a quick brief introduction on the locality and background of Lubumbashi. So Lubumbashi is based in Haut-Katanga province. It's situated in the southeastern parts of DRC, and it's actually bordered by various countries, just to mention a few, Zambia, Angola, and Tanzania. And, you know, after the capital of Kinshasa, Lubumbashi is actually the richest and the second largest city in the DRC because of its history and economic standing and population. So in comparison actually to other countries, Lubumbashi doesn't have like districts. They have communes, of which like these communes have their own organizational and governance structures. And then Lubumbashi, like during its colonial era, it was known as Elizabethville, which was actually founded by the Belgian authorities in 1910. And, you know, during the time, it was under the rule of King Leopold II. And, you know, by the locals, it was actually known as the Congo Free State, of which as the time progressed on, or the years progressed on, in 1966, you know, the city was now renamed to Lubumbashi, which was now in honor of Patrice Lumumba, who was I think the Prime Minister of Lubumbashi, who really like played a pivotal role in, you know, the independence movement against the Belgian rule. Yeah, so you know, sorry. So Lubumbashi was actually utilized as a mining local resources. Hence, it gained popularity, and, you know, it was coined or termed the capital of copper. So next. So basically, like these two images, well, the first one, it depicts the vicinity or the footprint of Lubumbashi during like the colonial era, which was like highly infested or by thick and dense forestry, and it was like prior construction. And then the second image just basically depicts like during like globalization, during the globalization era, of which just clearly shows like growth and development. I know like the sketch is kind of like sort of a touch and go. Go next, Mashidu. So my colleague Mashidu will take you through the various maps that we have done research on. Mashidu, over to you.
All right, so as the history of
You're
Lubumbashi,
very faint. You're very faint, Mashuda. Just
and
come closer to the mic.
is it much more better?
Yes, that's good.
Okay. All right. As you've heard with the influence historically with Lubumbashi, so basically it was founded by the Belgium king, and it basically comprised of a copper mine, a copper and cobalt mine. So that's what made Lubumbashi so well known by people around the country as well as those who are beyond. And as the development or as the colonialists came and dwelled within the vicinity, there was a lady named Emily Wangabi, who arrived during the time of 1910 and proposed a grid, a structural grid that they would want the colonialists to be able to dwell in, and she called it a white haven. That's what she said, as I quote. And then the name of this camp. So as you've heard that Bulala mentioned that Lubumbashi is comprised of communes, and these communes are in the form of camps, and one of the names of these camps are called the Garden Court itself. So this, what I've highlighted here, what I've hatched is a Garden Court rigid setup. And then as time went on during the post-colonization, during the time at which Lubumbashi started gaining its independence, then during the time Lubumbashi started gaining its independence, we have our king, Lubumbashi, wanting to be able to regain authority of one of his spaces of the land. So this space is one of the space that I have highlighted down here. Was actually taken first by the colonialists via law. So the law is what outpowered the native of the land. And as a result, the urbanists continued developing their spaces down here towards the south. And then as you can see during post-globalization, as time came to a little bit of a halt as peace was thriving within the area. Lubumbashi, once again, by the way, is also known for its vibrancy of color and culture and social cohesion with the people. So as time went on, when liberation came about, the natives of the land began to adapt to the structural grid that Emily Wangabi came and proposed within the vicinity. And as you can see towards the north outskirts and the northeastern outskirts, there was a little bit of a combination of rigidness and organicness because of the natives of the land attempting to replicate what Emily Wangabi wanted to bring within the vicinity. And then we have our movement structure. Once again, like I did mention that she did propose this first in 1910. So this is the first form of this proposal. It's named the Garden Court. And then with this movement structure, once again with 1910, it was mainly influenced with the transportation routes that were entertained by the mining activity in Lubumbashi within the vicinity. And with that mining activity and the trade activity, it actually sprouted for a lot of visitation around the space. As a result, the expansion of the roads became quite rapid within the vicinity. By the way, Lubumbashi also comprises 90%, actually, no, I'm lying, 85% of residential buildings in comparison to your normal civic and commercial structure. And then this is your post globalization as well. And then we're coming down to the land use. Once again, we're starting off at 1910 with the mining space. So this is basically where it started. And then it spread over, once again, up to the north, coming down to the side. So as you can see that it's heavily densed by the garden court. And then the second attempt of the garden court going down to the south, as you can see that it became heavily densed. But this was now a mixture, not just of the colonialists, but also the natives of the land. Those natives who were staying within the vicinity mainly were those who were helping within, like doing the services with, sorry, I'm losing my words. No, you know, like your slaves at the mines and all of that. So they were basically workers of the space. And then there were some commercial slash civic buildings that started developing around the space, around the residential spaces. And then as well as your industrial buildings all the way up to the northern outskirts. But these industrial buildings were also comprised with residential as well. So they were a mix of two. And then this is, of course, your post-globalization as well. And then this is just initially the town grain, looking at how the movement structure kind of like influenced the figure ground now of the vicinity of the space. I will just point out again that this is the start of the mine, and this is the introduction of this vicinity or this garden court space within the center of the city. And then this is post-colonization. Once again, the rapid growth between the south as well as the north. Once again, the north comprised a little bit of industrial as well as residential. So it was a mix of two. And then you have your post-globalization. So why I'm highlighting also towards the north and the northeast, these two red squares, is just to indicate that with this globalization, what had happened is because of the vibrancy and the vibrancy of the natives of the people, there's a lot of these I'm losing my words. Oh, sorry, I forgot my words, but in context, I would just say that it's more towards a positive activity, like towards social cohesion. So this multicultural thing that they wanted, instead of this segregatory towns that Emily Wangabi had created within the space. And then this is followed now by your internal space patterns. This is a grid of the garden space, of the garden court. And then this is the expansion of that garden court, once again with your civic industrial buildings and then your residential portion. Once again, I'm highlighting to show the significant growth from the south. And then this is the post-globalization of internal spaces. And then we also have our king Lubumbashi, who was very much into the agricultural life of their natives, because the natives that lived there, things that they were eating and planting, they were very much into the agricultural lifestyle. So there was one emphasis in terms of having to preserve his lifestyle, his agricultural lifestyle, because he talks about preserving the footprint based on ancestral worship, as well as ancestral places where they would have their prayer times, or where they would bury their ancestors and all of that stuff. So a lot of this agricultural, or should I say the land itself, was used for a lot of these sacred things that people of Lubumbashi did. So Lubumbashi is very, very much heavily densed, and it really preserves its footprint. So as you can see with this internal spaces, how much of this bushy vegetation just hugs the space. And then there was no attempt inside Lubumbashi to open up your places like your parks or et cetera, because of its bushy vegetation. A lot of the things that Emily mentioned, she mentioned things of walking trails, things that were created during the colonial times. So all of those things were actually leading them to the vicinity of those of the forests around there, because there's a game park right around the northern vicinity of the city itself. So she mentions a lot about game parks. And then this is also for post-globalization with regards to the green spaces. As you can see, that the vegetation still is still very much preserved around the city itself.
Okay. So as I previously mentioned, so this is just like a sketch of the one of the mines in Lubumbashi, and oh, let's come closer. Okay. So this was actually used as one of the bases for mining local resources and copper. So basically, you know, like with its huge reserve of minerals and wealth, Lubumbashi actually supplies like 3% of the world's copper, which, you know, basically most of it comes from Lubumbashi in the House Katanga. And this is actually one of the Tiko mines that's owned by the DRC in joint venture with the Chinese. So, thank you.
Thanks, Bulelo and Mashudu. Can we have the final group?
Can you see my screen, Vilo?
Yes, I can see it.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. My group member, Lucia, and I decided to keep things local and do Cape Town. So Cape Town is defined by elements such as its natural beauty, Table Mountain, and how the city sort of meanders around the base of the mountain. Its vibrant culture and its rich history is also plays a very important role in what makes Cape Town the city that it is. Over time, the port and the waterfront have also become very defining features of Cape Town, uh, and has sort of become synonymous with the city over time. Cape Town was actually named the Cape of the Good Hope by King John II in the hopes of finding a sea route to India upon landing in South Africa. Later on, a town formed around where the Dutch settled and was later renamed Cape Town in the 1700s. In terms of its establishment, it was actually the Dutch East India Company, which was led by Jan van Riebeeck at the time, which established Cape Town in 1652 for the intended purpose of being a supply and a the replenishment station for ships traveling to the East Indies. It later became a very prominent trade hub as a result of global integration. Here we have a sketch of Cape Town, basically showing how the city sits at the base of the mountain and how it sort of the meanders around the base. Later we will explore how and why the development start to move up the slope of the mountain. In terms of town origins, most of the urban development of Cape Town took place between the inception of the town, which was in the 1600s, all the way through to the colonial period as shown in the map. It is here that we sort of start to see fragments of city expansion on the east-west axis of the city, and as well as on the mountain slope. The time of forced removal saw massive industrial growth along the coast, in addition to new residential buildings along the base of the mountain as a result of a growing population at the time. During the post-colonial period, we can see further development of small residential buildings, mainly in Lion's Head and along the west edge of the city center. You can see it sort of taking form by sort of like the form of the city scape was sort of being dictated by the curvature of the mountain. Finally, in the globalized period, we see the city as it is now. We can see the expansion of the recreational zone along the coast of the west, along the coast on the west of Cape Town as a result of the 2010 FIFA World Cup. The multiple revitalization projects also occurred uh, during the globalized time. Overall, we see a densification of the urban fabric in addition to even further growth of the ports for the purpose of being able to fully integrate the port into the global market.
We then looked at the movement structure in the colonial rule early 1900s. In the 1930s, Cape Town mostly adopted a grid street pattern, which had originated from colonial Britain. However, due to the topography of Cape Town and the steep gradient of Table Mountain, as the road network dissipates inland, it becomes irregular. Next. During forced removal, there hadn't been much change except for newer developments on the outskirts, which had now needed smaller roads to accommodate these. You can also see that how up the mountain, these roads become irregular and start conforming to the topography rather than the strict street pattern. This is similar in post-colonization, except for the new additions of smaller roads to accommodate the city buildings on the city outskirts. Next slide. And in globalization era, there hadn't been much changes except along the city periphery and as well as small areas to the west of the port to accommodate the trade and this growing economy of Cape Town. Next slide.
We also looked at the land use and zoning of Cape Town. In the 1900s, the CBD grew and became a part of the CBD grew, and the city started to benefit from the minerals found in other provinces, which was then imported into Cape Town and shipped to different parts of the globe. Due to Cape Town being primarily used for trade, the CBD was essential for the city to sort of function. Here in the time of forced removals, we see the city growing due to the better and more reliable transportation systems, mainly the growth of the railway line. The main land use at this time was zoned for the residential due to a growing population and was mainly focused around the edges of the central business district. Land use remained relatively the same in the time of post-colonization. Not much growth occurred in the following years due to the economic stagnation that happened due to apartheid, uh, uh, sanctions and the political instability that followed. In the current day, due to the end of apartheid, residential zoning and as well as and as well as the development of more the retail spaces occurred as a result of more people moving into the city. Further developments are always happening in Cape Town, even till now.
We then looked at the green space networks. You can see that urban development in Cape Town has almost morphed around the natural bushveld, which is the mountains. And the bushveld is essentially the untouched areas, while the green spaces are constructed green spaces like recreational areas such as playgrounds and parks. In the forest removal area, you can see that Cape Town has seen growth and there's large areas of encroachment into the natural bushveld. However, these developments are rather irregular and start conforming to the terrain of the mountain rather than the pattern that Cape Town originally had used. This area was very stagnant in terms of green spaces within the city. There were very minor areas of growth into the natural bushveld area up the mountain. And in the globalization area, this period had seen the biggest jump when it comes to constructed green spaces within the city due to the strong sustainability and green city movement. The bushveld also had seen more encroachment due to the population growth, but these buildings and developments again rather conform to the terrain.
In terms of the town green, the overall footprint of the city was dictated by the curvature of the mountain and as well as the coastline due to the city establishing itself as a port for trade and resupply. Once again, we see major growth during the during the time of forest removals. It is during this time that we really start to see the city sort of become extremely dense at the coastline. After the colonization period, we see more the movement up the mountain steps as the city sort of expanded as a result of an influx of people moving into the city. More space was needed to accommodate these people, which is why there was a need for more residential growth. In the present, we see a sort of a softening of the city edge as developments start to expand beyond the previous city be, beyond the previous city line. Densification along the port and at the west edge of the mountain base can be seen during this time as well.
We then looked at internal space pattern. This just makes it a bit more clear that you can see this strict grid iron street pattern, as well as how it starts to dissipate up the mountain, conforming to irregular shapes and the topography. It's similar in this area as well. The most notable area of expansion was the growth up Devil's Peak and Signal Hill. This area also saw the development of transport routes such as the train station and railway to accommodate the population as well as the growing economy. The post-colonization era developed many transport routes were developed to facilitate the movement in and around the city, also to facilitate the growing economy. As I mentioned before, trade had become very popular in Cape Town and had developed as well as the port. You can also see how there had been a lot of development start moving inland and conforming to the topography. In the globalization era, there was very minimal changes, but it mostly shows you what I had mentioned before, that because of the overpopulation, this grid iron pattern was almost impossible to conform to. And so they decided to move inland and up the mountain. And you can see all the new development is very irregular. This is just an interpretation drawing of Cape Town's harbor. I thought it was very interesting to watch its growth from just a basic anchorage in the start, and it has evolved to this vital maritime hub that has facilitated economic development and global trade. It has also played a pivotal role in shaping Cape Town and its prosperous city that it is today.
This is an interpretive drawing of the Castle of Good Hope. Uh, it is one of the main features of Cape Town and is regarded as the oldest building in South Africa. It was built between 1666 and 1679 by the Dutch East India Company. It served as a fortress and supply station for ships traveling between the Netherlands and the East Indies. Today, it is a museum and tourist attraction, and remains an integral part of Cape Town's urban landscape. Thank you.
Thanks, Monsieur Damien. Scooter, we'll hand back to you. We're done now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vilo. Thank you so much to the students for such amazing work that you shared with us. I quite enjoyed mostly the sketches, because I think that you actually get quite a good feel of what you're looking at, and better appreciation of the spaces and the routes if you actually draw it, other than if you had to show us maps, which we've all seen. So thank you so much to the whole class. Which brings me to another to my question, Vilo, that does this exercise make you want to propose interventions in the cities, because you've now laid it out and you've analyzed it, and you now have better understanding of what the gaps are, of how it works, and perhaps what does not work with it? Has it triggered something in you to look at something going forward in terms of proposals? You know, I know that in, let's say, 1940s, we were already talking about we'll be having flying cars in the cities and all that. So some of the things that could come up could be better transportation, how do we house people in the next 10, 20 years and all that. What's been your thought around that?
Yeah, thanks, Scooter. I think what this lesson actually does is highlight to students and architects as well, that the issues facing African continents are different from the European cities. So what this does is highlights the impact of colonization on cities and the impact of insurgency and informality and what that means for Africa. So looking at what the findings are, we're not limited in our master's thesis to be site-specific to Durban. So students can use this as a basis to say, I want to do my intervention in Bulawayo, for example, and I have a good understanding of the historical context and the urban context to actually realize what's the issues and how can I create an intervention. So I think something like this really helps us to understand the critical issues facing Africa and look at that as a way forward.
All right. Thank you, Vilo. I don't know if there's any questions or comments. There may not be many questions because it was essentially that just a lecture. We were mostly learning. Any comments, any questions from the floor?
I give you a quick comment. I need to run to my meeting. I only have 15 minutes left. So thank you very much. I like the approach of the mapping the city, and also the way the student try to explain it. But I just see one or two gaps that I want you to look at. When you look at the figure ground structure you created, it shows various aspects of the city. But if you are doing, this is in architecture. If you are doing it purely in planning, you can ask them to leave it in spatial planning at that level. I used to teach them there. But when you bring this to architecture, then you are approaching it into the European ways of architecture and city planning and urban design. That is the way they operate. Now, then it seems to me that the morphology of the city have not been analyzed. And that is very important. They've got a very good background, introduction to mapping of the city. But the mapping of the city also begin to suggest how do you identify the morphology of the city. For example, you could make a comparison between the traditional city core area as against the modern part of the city, or whatever you call it, colonization and globalization. So those are those issues that, because if you look at Marrakesh, for example, I've been there, I've done research there, also Cairo, I've been Port Louis, I've been all those areas. So what is missing, if you look the heart of Cairo, or even the European city that you look at, they have some sort of a relationship as an organic city inside, more of a human-oriented. And because of the time, there's no much imposition of vehicular movement. Everything is humane, more to pedestrian. So I would like that thing to be mapped out. Then when you look at Marrakesh, if you see the Bazaar Street in Marrakesh, it has a form, a geometrical broken form that the student can learn from it. They will draw it out and see the spatial quality and how those spaces are being used as against what they have in the modern aspect, which I feel that if you can allow them to do that, they can't do photographic will be difficult because they have not visited those cities. They can only do it in book. But also we want to see the characteristics of that particular city, what come out of this planning at the time. And then the issue of, I won't go too much of most of the things that I see, but the spatial quality, for example, the square, the space as a square and the space as a park is not the same. You want to map all those ones. I see it in the planning there. You want to highlight those ones and contrast those two together. Then in overall, they talk about colonial city, they talk a lot of globalization and all those sort of things. But one has to be very careful when you use this terminology in theory and history, you must date it. Because when you are talking the growth of cities, they grow from a certain nucleus inside with a date, and then they start expanding. And then because city is dynamic, it's not static. Many years to come, all those things will change. So that is what issue that I would like to see. I won't like them to take it into, although it affects South Africa, because there are two ideological in city. There's the colonial city, there's segregation, and there's political segregation, there's economic segregation. So those two issues would be nice to map it up. Where is the rich people living in this area? Where is the poor people living? How has that emerged over the time? And all those sort of things. But it's a continuous on the same study. There's no even need for them to go and take another assignment. You could take them and later you can ask them to do a design in the place. And the design in the place also will help them to interpret the architecture of the place. because each of these cities you see have their own significant architectural typology and approach. I've done that with American students when they used to send them to me when I was in East Africa. We give them a place to study Mombasa, and later we ask them to design within the place. Some make continuity of what is there, some imposition of a new type of architecture. So I really like this exercise of yours, but I don't think you should stop it there. You should take it further to the next level to reach the level of architecture. Thank you. I have to run away. Just let me.
Thanks, Prof. Thanks.
Yeah.
Definitely, those are good points we'll take forward.
Okay. So
Thank you, Prof.
Thank you.
Then Adima. Over to you, Mr. White.
Yes, hello. Thank you. Thank you very much. And thanks to all the presenters. I have a question or comment, I suppose, to the two lecturers. You mentioned at the beginning macro, meso, and micro scales. I would have liked a better balance between. There was a lot of emphasis on the macro scale. I would like to have seen particularly how the macro informs the micro. And I suppose, yeah, so it would be that balance that I'm just questioning. I think it leads me to my second comment is on the vertical scale. I found there was a lot of mapping, which is what you have to do at the macro scale. But I would like to have seen the vertical dimension a little bit on these cities. You know, Marrakesh is a 3-story city. Cairo is a 6-story city. I haven't been to Lubumbashi. Is it a 2-story city? So I think the way the vertical dimension informs the cities is also very important. So it was just, yeah, two of those general comments. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Kirk. I think those are very good points. And also just listening to Prof. Adebayo, the challenge we probably have is that this is a module that's not necessarily the same as the design module, where they do actually work within that macro, meso, and micro, and that's they engage in person more so than just kind of looking at it from a desktop study, which is unfortunately what we have to do with this project. But I think there's lots of value. You know, we in the design analysis in the urban module, we do street sections and we certainly look at kind of build form in a more 3-dimensional way. So it's I guess I think you're raising good points, and it's just how can we start integrating this more with the design, as Prof. Adebayo was saying, and then you'd need to look at it in a more micro level. So it's great to have this engagement because we can involve our program through this. Thanks.
Thanks, Kirk, Magda. Adima, then I'll take Sabrina.
How's it, everyone? It's Miguel speaking first. I don't know what's happened with our video. I think the suggestion that Kirk made and Prof, I think it's kind of yeah, getting the street level would be a good idea. Maybe somehow integrated at a later point. But my comment was is more for the students and the staff. I think you know, being a former student from UKZN, I kind of subscribe to the notion of seeing universities as these places where criticality is encouraged and developed. So, you know, I would urge the students moving beyond this place to take that into practices, because I think that sometimes the continuity between university and practices that towards that creating that meaningful change that that you guys started with sometimes gets a bit lost. So yeah, I think it's more of a comment of encouragement, and well done to Bilo and to Magda and the students for putting up this presentation.
Because I think that there's a value, and I remember so when we did it, Magda alluded to it earlier. When we did it, it was largely focused on Durban and areas within Durban, and so it was an interesting thing to kind of look at the urban scale with the sensitivities of the lens of an architect, and I think the only exception to that is maybe the kind of modernist attempts by Le Corbusier's La Ville Radieuse and Brasilia. And I think what we've seen most recently, even on this platform, Squira, a couple of weeks ago, just this idea of the necessity for sensitivity to overcome this notion of city planning and urban design as a performance-based exercise and shift it again to a needs-based exercise. And I think that's what these comparative exercises give us. And so maybe from the perspective that Miguel shared to encouragement to students to maybe also think critically and comparatively across what you're looking at, so that you start to understand both commonalities due to whether it's ruptures by coloniality or apartheid or disastrous contemporary shampoo bottle type architectures. We need to be very critical when we're looking to honestly and earnestly go back to the values of creating cities as places for people to live their lives and what that demonstrates. And so, yeah, it was really nice to see some of the students, and thank you, Magda and Vilo, for sharing that with us. And remember, I suppose, that civic gestures are exactly that. They are gestures for people and place. So don't get lost in it and keep sketching. There were some really interesting gestures towards architectural drawing. So yeah, thanks everybody.
Thanks, Adima and Miguel. Sivu?
Thank you so much, Skura. Thank you, Magda and Vilo, and to the students. Now, my comment is just a question first. I wanted to ask if you have another exercise, maybe not necessarily in a single year, maybe in different years, where you focus on South African cities. The reason why I'm asking that, because you see, because at this level, because you're studying cities which you have never been to, you rely on the information that is published, that is there. Sometimes information that you find is not in line with what you want to teach the students. So sometimes you are limited. It has to be at a very higher level. It's very difficult to zoom into. Whereas maybe the next level would be to give students maybe South African cities, not any South African cities, selected South African cities, which you know that they will have certain qualities that you want. The advantage with that is that they can go in person, they can photograph, they can analyze those cities from the founding times up to now. And I think they could benefit a lot from doing that exercise. But as for the exercise they are doing now, I think it's a very good start in understanding the urban settlements. And also, if they are given South African cities, I think what Prof was saying is that they could also not analyze sort of like the economic segregation of the city, social segregation, and all of that. But all in all, I think this one it gives a very good understanding and background of urban settlements. Thank you so much.
Lovely, good point, Sivu. Rob will be our last hand. Rob Russo. You probably need to unmute, Rob. Hey, Rob. I don't know if we lost him. But I like your point, Sivu, that if you can actually walk in a city, you probably could have a much better analysis on that. Rob?
Skura, sorry, we couldn't unmute myself. I'm on the line now. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. Sure.
Okay. Firstly, to Vilo and Magda, thank you very much. I'm absolutely fascinated by this whole presentation, and particularly because I spent a long time going through the exhibition. What I found really exciting about the exhibition was that those students who wanted to had an opportunity to look at cities of their choice. And today's presentation has given us a spread of various cities. It is obvious that this is an exercise in itself and that there had to be some commonalities. So I assume that there were a series of templates that were set for the students. Again, it is very evident how some students have benefited from those templates and others did not quite make what they should have out of it. I think that an exercise like this can only have limited outcomes because of the limitations on the times that are available. And as such, the exercise in having discipline put before you is itself very good. I want to commend the one on Marrakesh because I think the presentation was superb. I think the way the two speakers presented it, their drawings, was really commendable. And it sets a bar for others to follow. Inevitably, if you go through the whole exhibition, there are holes that you can punch into it. On one of the presentations here, there was a very glaring spelling mistake. Those are minor issues. The issue that the students were taken out of their comfort zone and told to go and do research, some of the research is biased. Yes, you must just find out where the biases are and then evaluate whether that should be included or not. Others took the high points, and I think I'd like to thank the lecturers for what they have put together here, because it was really most enjoyable and the exhibition was daunting. It's really, by the end of walking around it, you had a headache, but it was worth it. Thank you.
Nice comment. Thank you, Robert. Just parting words, Vilo and Martha. Thank you so much for the presentation. Thank you so much to the students.
Thanks, Kura. I just want to, I think, maybe use this opportunity to do a bit of PR and appeal to our members to see, the work we're doing at university and the benefit it has for students. We're also trying to grow our Peter Zitman Fund. So I think we'll send an email out soon to say, contribute towards that fund because it goes towards helping students in the long run. So yeah, thanks for that, Kura.
Yeah, from my side also, thank you, Robert. I think you were very apt in your comments. It is an exercise and there were gaps, we know that. And yes, it's a lot to take in. But yeah, I think it's great, this interaction, and I think we should do more of it, going forward.
Definitely.
We have the exhibitions, but I think this opportunity lets a lot of other people also engage with the work. So we will definitely look at more opportunities to get our students to present. Thank you.
Thank you, Magna. Thank you, Vilo. Definitely we will have to do more. I will have to say it in public to the Vice President Adima. I've thrown a challenge to DUT as well. We should definitely do this, so we will hear from them. Not to put you on the spot. Colleagues, a very important announcement is that on Thursday, we've arranged a meeting with the city, the plans submission department, right? So could you please email Kiara any concerns you have with how plan submission takes place in Durban, the duration, and all of that? We'd like to just sit down with them. It will be a hybrid meeting, but it will be at 160 Bula Road. We would like to sit down and just try and iron out everything that we feel is hindering plans, specifically just the plans process, submission, the town planning submission afterwards, and circulating with all the other departments, because it affects our practice in as architects, business, investment, and all that in the city. So we've had very few questions and comments on that. So if anybody else would like to add something, please do, so that the guys can come in prepared on Thursday. So if you could please do that by the end of the day, we will appreciate that. Otherwise, may everyone have a good weekend, and thank you so much for joining.
Thanks, Kurat. Thanks, everybody.
Bye. Bye.